So when I was approached by AICA, I was asked to talk about how Ukrainian art is researched in the Western academia. You know, who write about what and how. And first I thought that it would be a totally unsurmountable project to do this kind of bibliographical survey and see who writes about Ukrainian art. Anyway, so I went, what I did is that I went to JSTOR, which is one of the largest databases of articles in humanities, and I typed Ukrainian artist, and I decided to start this bibliographical survey this way. And I was actually astonished at the results of the search, because I got about 100 entries, but then I looked through them. There were a lot of ethnographical and music and literary material. So when I actually looked through them, I found 6 articles on Ukrainian visual art. I found articles on six artists, and the first one was Johann Georg Pinzel. It's a Baroque sculptor of most likely Germanic origin, who worked in Ukraine in the second half of the 18th century. Another article was on Taras Shevchenko. It's a romantic poet and painter responsible for the revival of the Ukrainian national spirit. Then there was one article on Alexander Archipenko and one on Kazimir Malevich, two notable representatives of the avant-garde of the 20th century. Then one more article on Yakov Gniezdowski. It's a Ukrainian-born graphic artist who lived most of his life in the US. And the last article was on Boris Mikhailov, a contemporary international renowned photographer. So even people with the most cursory knowledge of Ukraine should be very surprised at the brevity and the total randomness of this list. So how is it possible that the country with such a long record of existence that also featured moments of great political and cultural significance, well, if not now, then in the past, how is it possible that a country like that can be represented by 6 artists in this Anglo-American academic discourse? So that's when one begins to wonder at what kind of mechanisms of exclusion and repression that have been at work that have reduced the centuries-long history of Ukraine into 6 personalities. So the present article and present talk is going to briefly state 2 major exclusion mechanisms that apply to Ukrainian art and culture at large. That is that of Russification and provincialization. And then I'll consider a case of Boris Mikhailov as a battleground for both of these mechanisms, which have repositioned him as a Russian artist and also excluded any mention of a larger photographic context of his native city, Kharkiv, which has fostered Mikhailov's creative identity. So the situation of marginalization of Ukrainian culture directly feeds into the status of Ukrainian studies within the Western canon of Slavic studies. Numerous works by George Grabovich, and he's a professor of Ukrainian literature and one of the key personalities behind the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. So his works summarize the issue of scholarly priorities within the field that largely tends to treat Ukraine as a subsidiary to greater powers that dominated over the country throughout the last 3 centuries. Colonial experience happened to be a part of the Ukrainian reality since the end of the 17th century, when the parts of the country belonged to Russian, Polish, Austro-Hungarian, and then later Soviet Empire. Clearly there is a big difference between studying a province or a region and then studying a country. And in spite of Ukraine's independence gained in 1991, the hierarchy still stands. Ukrainian art and culture at large are still very niche topics, exotic and peripheral in the framework of Slavic studies. Grabovich also speaks of the denationalization of the elites as one of the colonial strategies at work throughout the colonial history of Ukraine, and notably during the Soviet rule. Ukrainians merited a chance to practice their chosen profession and advance in life as long as they disregarded or at least did not insist too much on their national origin. And that was true not just for Ukrainians, but for any kind of ethnic group within the Soviet Union specifically, Georgians or Belarusians or Kazakh or whoever. So denationalization often accompanied a move to the center that was Moscow or St. Petersburg, which enabled better access to cultural and economic resources. And those who lingered in the periphery, so to say, were continuously neglected as insignificant and provincial to higher cultural discourse. So in this way, Soviet system of social mobility yielded a massive exodus of talented and ambitious cultural practitioners from the peripheries of the empire to its center. And those people have ever been referred to as Russians, irrespectively of their ethnic origins, and they formed a canon of a greater Russian culture. So resistance to colonial ideological constructions has recently started to generate some revisionist scholarship of Ukrainian art, attempting to rethink and recast the canon of national culture. Well, curiously enough, such revisionism largely comes from scholars of Ukrainian origin, of course, or those who, for various reasons, are personally invested into supporting Ukrainian art. It hasn't acquired this kind of wider appeal in the academy. Most Russian and Western academic practitioners tend to disregard ethnic or national differences, conflating Soviet and Russian, or even Ukrainian and Russian. The issue of conflating identities flourishes especially prominently with the so-called Russian avant-garde, an intricate conglomeration of multifarious artistic movements of the first half of the 20th century that aesthetically and conceptually consisted of various avant-gardes, most of which can be called Russian, Belarus, Lithuanian, Jewish, and only in some cases Russian. For example, and then so about the revisionist scholarship, Jean-Claude Marcadet, it's a director of research emeritus at the French National Center of Scientific Research, has spent years analyzing works of Kazimir Malevich. So that's one of the contested painters, Russian, Ukrainian, Polish for the same reason. So he studied Kazimir Malevich with an emphasis on Malevich's Ukrainian connection. So Malevich, born in Kiev, into a Polish-Ukrainian family, Malevich spent first 17 years of his life in Ukraine, which, according to Marcadet, colored his perception of the world and definitely affected his writing style that resembled that of Gogol's poetics. And overall, Marcadet differentiates between three schools within the Russian, in quotes, avant-garde of the 20th century, that of St. Petersburg, Moscow, and Ukraine, and he attributed such people as Alexander Ekster, David and Volodymyr Burlyuk, Alexander Archipenko, Kazimir Malevich, to the Ukrainian branch of this Russian avant-garde. A number of other studies dedicated to Ukrainian avant-garde brings to light larger cultural context of Kiev, Kharkiv, Odessa of the 20th century. Another way they deal with this issue of provincialization. For example, Miroslava Mudrak, professor of art history at The Ohio State University, in her pioneering work on Ukrainian artistic modernism, creates a complex picture of the country's social and artistic environment through reconstructing historical art scenes, reviewing journals, and recasting intellectual debates of the time. Another good source is Irene Makarik, a professor of English and theater at the University of Ottawa, and Virlyana Tkach, one of the directors of La Mama Experimental Theater in New York. In their edited volume of essays on modernism in Kiev, they follow a similar research route of profiling a vibrant intellectual milieu of the city centered around the personality of Les Kurbas. He was a renowned Ukrainian theater director, perished in the purges of 1937. So both Mudrak and Makarik and Tkach scholarly contributions convincingly demonstrate that Ukraine of the early 20th century can hardly be viewed as a provincial backwaters to the great Russian or Soviet empire. Positioning Ukraine of the time as one of the important centers of European modernism breaks a faulty logic of approaching Alexander Archipenko, Kazimir Malevich, Alexandra Ekstar, and other major avant-garde artists of Ukrainian background as solitary geniuses that started acquiring their cultural currency once they actually moved from the so-called provincial Ukrainian atmosphere. Well, unfortunately, this revisionist approach has not yet generated a widespread sensitivity to the Ukrainian post-colonial position within the wider art historical and critical domains. In the case of Boris Mikhailov, serves as a telling illustration that imperial attitudes still persist. Mikhailov is often referred to as a Russian photographer, although this claim is hardly justified. Compared to the avant-garde artists of the early 20th century, most of whom indeed received their education in Russia or relocated to Moscow or St. Petersburg, Mikhailov has never been formally affiliated with Russia. He never lived there, he never studied there. He was born in Kharkiv in Ukraine in 1938 to a Ukrainian Jewish family, and he lived in that city until 1995, and then at the age of 57 he moved to Berlin. Moreover, much of Mikhailov's imagery stems from the very particular social and economic conditions of Kharkiv, Berdyansk, Crimea, and other places in Ukraine. So this rootedness in the local material differs greatly from the attitude of the early Ukrainian and Soviet avant-gardists who believed in this existence of essential and universal forms of art and were engaged in the purposeful pursuit of those forms, which largely excluded any ethnic identification or national flavor. So it's indeed very difficult to claim that Malevich is Ukrainian, analyzing his work and finding something Ukrainian there. But in the case of Mikhailov, who actually photographed that particular country at that time, it's easy to see the connection there. So by comparison, Mikhailov photographs purposefully reflect the life of the Soviet and post-Soviet Ukraine. Well, a number of contemporary Russian critics and those of Russian origin call Mikhailov a Russian photographer, or go even further to claim that his works belong to the Moscow conceptualist movement. For example, Margarita Tupitsyn, one of the leading independent scholars of Soviet art, attempts to connect the origin of Mikhailov's artistic practice to that of Ilya Kabakov. Tupitsyn claims that emerging from a provincial milieu, again, Mikhailov did not have much intellectual awareness until he went to see Kabakov and got enlightened about his own artistic process. So, quote, when he, Mikhailov, returned to his native Kharkov, access to the intellectual discourse on photography was put on hold until his next visit to the Soviet capital. End of quote. So this originary myth contradicts the real state of affairs even on the level of mere chronology. By the time Mikhailov first met Kabakov at the end of 1970s, he already made quite a few photo series that propelled him to the state of a well-known photographer. So this is one of the series, it's called Red Series, that he photographed throughout the end of 60s and mid-70s. And he chose scenes where there was a lot of red, and it was easy because red was everywhere during the Soviet times. But he also hand-colored, he enhanced the red, so it's kind of the extra emphasis on that color. Another series that was already known by the time, again, he met Kabakov is called Superimposition. And he started imposing several slides one upon another. So several examples of this series. And some of the slides it was photograph upon a photograph, and some of them were texts upon a photograph. So Tupitsin credits Kabakov with the discovery of new artistic material, that of collective utterances of the Soviet life, and then she basically asserts that Mikhailov borrowed that material from Kabakov for his own practice. So this attempt to establish a linear originary trace instead of discursive contemporaneity reveals an imperial agenda on the centripetal cultural stance. Everything accumulates in Moscow and receives its true value there. What Tupitsin and other critics disregard in connection to Mikhailov is the existence of a coherent Kharkiv school of photography with its various subgroups that function both on a formal, organized level and on a level of conceptual and aesthetic affiliations. So in spite of some Russian critics' view of Kharkiv as and there is a quote from Victor Miziano, not particularly picturesque industrial area, more of a non-place than a city, end of quote. Rigorous intellectual debates were very much part of Vremya photo club, or time. Vremya is time, which besides Mikhailov consisted of 7 other photographers and functioned from, this photo club existed from 1971 to 1979. And the following internationally known photographers as Sergei Brodkov, Roman Petkovka, Misha Pedan also come from this Kharkiv photographic school. And the vibrant artistic atmosphere of the city keeps breeding new photographic generations, among which is a Shilo group, Roman Minin, and Hamlet Zinkovsky. But then what's more important is that Kharkiv school exists also as a set of artistic practices, such as aestheticization of late Soviet epoch. And they kind of come from Mikhailov's work, but then there is a continuation. So, for example, Misha Pedan, he just published a book of photographs from the 1980s that's called La Belle Époque. So this is the front cover, well, the actual book, and then there is a super cover that looks like this, one of those paper folders from the Soviet times. And there are more photographs from his book. So another artistic practice or like artistic gesture is collaging and superimposing, and we've already seen it in Mikhailov, and here is one with Roman Petkovka. This is a series that's called Sandwich Memory. So what he did, if Mikhailov was putting 2 photographs one upon another, Petkovka here actually projected photographs upon bodies of, I don't know, friends or let's say performers. So there is this kind of comment on how the Soviet ideology was literally imposed on a body of a Soviet subject. So there is another photograph of that series. And hand coloring is one of the key features of the Kharkiv School of Photography. And here is a project by Vladislav Krasnoshok. He is from an Shilo art group. And the series is called Negatives Are on Files, or on File. He collected old photographs from like the turn of the century, and he hand-colored them with this. And the thing is that all of those photographs had, they have a stamp of a photographer, and then they also, on the reverse side, they would say, negatives are on file, meaning that if you lost a photograph or something, you can come and they're going to make you another copy. And so a lot of people, when he showed them this project in the gallery, there were a lot of visitors saying, oh, that's vandalism, that's just brutal. How can you treat, a historic object and beautiful photograph like that? And he would tell them, oh, but negatives are on file, so you can go make another copy, which obviously you can't because, it's a very old photograph. So there is an interesting comment on the authenticity and reproducibility of a photo medium. Another series that also uses this hand coloring is by Roman Minin. Well, this is one photograph from the series that's called Bridge Burning, and another is On Polar Light. So what he does is that he actually colors film negatives with a marker, which is apparently very acidic, and it starts eating up the emulsion layer, and it creates this kind of weird, weird marks there. I think that's the last slide. So anyway, so we see we see that there is a connection between all these photographers, and obviously Mikhailov didn't just come out of nowhere. It's not like there is a desert and then he all of a sudden, that's what the Russian critics say, that he all of a sudden emerged from, nowhere, and then he went to Moscow, and that's when he became famous. That's obviously not true. So similarly to this revisionist discourse of the Russian avant-garde, which upon a closer inspection turned out to be a conglomeration of various avant-gardes, not all of them necessarily Russian, a conceptualist movement that is referred as Moscow conceptualism most of the time. This movement might also lose its deceptive unitary nature, breaking into a number of Soviet conceptualisms with various ethnic flavors. But then engaging in another tug of war of reclaiming Ukrainian art brings to the fore the necessity of redefining the foundational principles of the entire art critical discourse in relation to post-colonial spaces, rather than winning in the game's individual rounds. So that's the end of my presentation.
Okay, thank you, Olena. Thank you very much for your presentation. Also, thank you very much for keeping the time schedule. Are there any questions?
Hi, Lisa Streifeld from the U.S. I found myself writing a lot about Ukrainian art around the turn of the millennium, because in my reporting territory was a Ukrainian art gallery. Art gallery that showed Ukrainian art. And I was finding incredible universal imagery that I couldn't find in American art at the time. And I was tracing it back, I guess, to the religious, the fact that so much icons were painted by Ukrainian artists.
Yeah.
Can you speak, first of all, to the fact of the diaspora? There's a huge Ukrainian museum right on 79th Street. It's amazing, what you find when you go in this place. And how much that has affected the building of a narrative of Ukrainian art, as opposed to the Russian dominance.
In fact, with the case of Kazimir Malevich, in fact, it all started with diaspora, because they are the most vocal about, a certain Ukrainian origin and Ukrainian nationality. So they are most supportive of that.
But also addressing the issue of the religious iconography, and is that part of the repression, the communists, that they wanted to repress that part of...
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Because, you were not supposed to be it was forbidden. The Soviet Union was its own religion, actually. There's a lot written about it, that it's the state was, it has kind of a quasi-religious paradigm. There was its own god, Stalin, and there are a number of martyrs. They didn't want a competition.
But that would be cutting off Ukraine from its own roots. Right there is a really...
Yeah.
Yeah. But despite that, in the diaspora, I was finding a lot of universal imagery that it was obvious to trace that back to that history of...
Universal as in icons from the Orthodox?
No, it's contemporary universal that I think all artists would be striving towards. I just found Ukrainian artists were much more prone to be accessing it,
Perhaps.
It's just an interesting observation.
Danielle Perrier. I wonder, I think the Ukrainian prohibition is much older than the communism, because there was already under Tsar Alexander II, the prohibition of speaking Ukrainian, and they could just sing, but they could not speak their language. So it is a very long prohibition to experience themselves, and perhaps we should also take this into consideration, that it is a very long prohibition, much more than only under the communism. And it started in because it was how do you say, the law was made in Bad Ems, and one of the Ukrainian artists I had as resident, Taras Polataiko, made a work on this specific moment and on the not recognition of the Ukrainian people.
Yeah, definitely. Well, the EMS law was in the end of the 19th century, but the repression of the Ukrainian, it started much earlier, and actually I did say that it was, from really 17th century, then there was a lot of... I was asked today, how is that the Baltic countries actually talk about, the Soviet time as, what did you say, as occupation, and then Ukrainians talk about colonization, and my answer was, well, the Baltic countries were occupied, and since 1944, that's when they were annexed to the Soviet Union. Ukrainians, it happened to them since 17th century. For like 3 centuries, you kind of forgot that it was an occupation and became a colony. But definitely, it was much earlier than the Soviet times.
As I am Polish, Dorota Monkiewicz, Poland, and I will say something perhaps politically incorrect, but here I heard a very new narration about art history, and especially Kazimierz Malewicz. Because in Polish art history, Kazimierz Malewicz said that he was born to the Polish parents in Ukrainian because this was a diaspora. And in Polish art history, we understand him not really a Russian artist or an Ukrainian artist, but an artist of Soviet. He joined of Soviet Union. He joined the revolution, and for him it was not important if he was Polish, Ukrainian, or Russian, because he was just a revolutionary artist. And I must say that this is for me very new what you say, and very interesting to listen that he was an Ukrainian artist. Thank you.
Well, I've commented on that for those modernists, the nationality, ethnicity was not important. That's true, and they never reflected in their art. They were universalist, if nothing else. But then, if somebody was born in Ukraine, lived there for 17 years, spoke the language, and it really affected him, can we call him Ukrainian? And then, is it important to call anyone, Yeah.
I don't know if to criticize it or not. I only want to say that it is very strange for me because now after 1989 there appear new nations were always, but new countries, new states. And then every state needs to have its roots, cultural roots and cultural identity. And for example, we Polish, we have some problems because we know that our biggest romantic poet, Adam Mickiewicz, is as well Polish biggest poet and Lithuanian biggest poet and Belarusian biggest poet. Then we discover new identities of the literature. And with Malewicz, for me, it's really very striking because we don't claim, Polish, that he's a Polish artist, though he was Polish born and speaking Polish. So for me, it is quite complicated, I must say, to rewriting the history, and we have to be very conscious not to go too much on the other side. Let's keep balance, I would ask for. Thank you.
Yeah, can I just add that I had something of the same surprise as Dorota, because I went to Kiev in 1985 during the communist time. And the director of the museum in Kiev kind of indoctrinated me in the idea that Malevich was Ukrainian because his art related to the folk art of Ukraine and to the religion, the symbols, the color red even, he said, was a Ukrainian, not a Soviet, so on. And I rather agree with Dorota. We have to beware, on the one hand, of course, of universalisms and imperial art histories, if you like, but I think we have to beware also of constructing new national identities and art histories, except insofar as we must recognize somewhat cynically that we all have to construct identities and that all identities are part myth. So let's accept their myths, but in a way, my final conclusion is it's lovely to look at work that shows coherence as a group, like the photographs, the photographic work you showed. Let's bring things down to a modest level and see what has genuine cohesion and coherence and enjoy it for what it is and try to deconstruct some of these myths, and particularly those of national or imperial identity.
Okay, you don't need to comment this question. Okay, the last question, please.
Yeah, it's maybe not a question, it's also a comment to the previous discussion. I just would like to refer to Boris Groys, who said that this rise of nationalism after 1989 and the discussions that is now on, it refers, we have to ask why is there this rise of nationalism after 1989? It's nothing else but the reaction to the market. So I think that this is what I would like to say.
Do you want to comment this point? Okay, then thank you very much for your questions. Thanks to Olena for your presentation.